Hi guys, welcome back. And in this video here, we're going to talk about a subject that's called electrical plumbing current. And this is a subject that's really come into my awareness more, as of recently. And it's something that I learned a little bit about kind of when I first got into this field here, back when I was really struggling with Lyme disease. And I was kind of forced to really kind of look at this EMF world because I was really getting bombarded by it. Jesse and I both were, and I came across this subject of plumbing current, and I did a few measurements in my own home, but at the time, it wasn't something that I was really too concerned about because, well, really the measurements I was getting in my home, they weren't anything significant. So I looked into it, but I didn't do a whole lot with it at the time. But now that I'm really going out into the field more, this is something I'm checking for in every home that I go into. And this is really turning into be a much bigger problem than I really anticipated, at least from my perspective and what I'm seeing here. And really what plumbing current is, it's really the cold water pipe that comes into your home. What we're finding is that this cold water pipe is really live with electricity. And it depends on the home, it depends on the area. What I'm finding is that some homes, the level of electricity that I'm seeing on this cold water pipe is lower than in some areas. But fundamentally what we're seeing is that cold water pipe is live with electricity. Now this really becomes significant because this cold water pipe, it comes into your house, it feeds your hot water tank, it's distributed throughout, maybe the walls, the flooring that you're walking on, and it feeds all the fixtures in your bathrooms. So this cold water pipe here, it's running through your house. And really once we start to push current through any type of conductor, this is when we see the rotating magnetic field kind of come into existence here. And this is something that's really important to see because this rotating magnetic field, if you're following along with some of my other videos here, what I'm suggesting with this rotating magnetic field is that this is what's truly simulating information, which is a different theory to consider than anything else that's out there today. But all my work is going towards this. Now, this information field that I'm talking about here that is really being simulated by the rotating magnetic field, it's really coming from a lot of the dirty harmonics that are present on our power system. And if you remember from part 1 of my electric field series, I kind of touched on harmonics, on how when we looked at the power systems that are coming into our home, especially here in North America, it's a signal that's kind of oscillating at 60 times per second. And the harmonics are just multiples of that. And a lot of this dirty electric current that's flowing on our water pipes are really just a play of that. And for those people that are really chronically sick, especially those people with Lyme disease, these are people that are really, what I'm seeing, that are really extra sensitive to these changes in this EMF world that I'm talking about here. So if we can imagine that, this cold water pipe, it may even be running through your floor. And we've seen, there has been examples of this out there. That cold water pipe that could be running through your floor, that's carrying a lot of this dirty electricity, that rotating magnetic field it's going to be there. And we can even measure that. And it's going to be, cycling a lot of these dirty harmonics. And if you're walking on the floor, if you're even sitting on the floor, if you have children that are kind of crawling on the floor, and this is the type of activity that's happening there, this is something that we all seriously need to pay attention to. So really in this video here, it's really kind of my primary focus to kind of look at, what's the source of this dirty electric current that we're seeing on our cold water pipes that are really, that cold water pipe is buried into the earth. So I kind of want to just do more of an introduction to that, to kind of show you guys where I see a lot of this is coming from. And there's one particular place that I'm going to be primarily focusing on as we go along here. So I'm going to be covering a lot of that in this video. And at the end of this video, I'm actually going to do some live demonstrations to kind of show you what I'm finding out in the field. And I'm going to show you kind of what I found here in my own home. And I'm going to show you what I'm finding in some of my clients' house within the city here of the Greater Toronto area. And some of the results I'm getting are very significant. And I'm really collecting a lot of data here on this. And I'm really trying to see what is really responsible for this. And this video here is, like I said, just more of an introduction to this to kind of get everybody more familiar with this subject, because I see something that's really kind of going on deeper in the earth that could potentially be causing a lot of other issues here for people who are chronically sick. Now, this really has to do with the idea of what's called electrical grounding in the electrical engineering world. And in my personal opinion, I think the idea of this electrical grounding concept here, I think, is probably the most least understood subjects in all of science. But in the electrical engineering world, we have to use it. I mean, there's no such thing as electrical engineering science without that electrical ground present. And really the idea is as to why we use it is to provide a level of safety. Because this power distribution system that we've created here that's kind of powering up our home, I mean, there's the potential that you could get an electrical shock. You could even get electrocuted if the conditions are right. But by providing a lower resistance kind of path to the earth and connecting that into our electrical systems, it really provides a means for that electricity to kind of discharge itself to the earth as opposed to going through you. So that's really a kind of a basic description as to why we use it. So it needs to be there. But now going back to this cold water pipe that comes into your house, if you notice here that at the bottom of it, usually within about maybe 6-8 inches as to where that pipe comes into your house, there's usually a connection point there. There's usually a clamp that goes around that cold water pipe, like you can see here, and there's a wire that's terminated to it. And what's happening is that wire that's terminated to your cold water pipe, it's actually making a connection up into your electrical panel. And really what's happening here in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, what we're doing is we're using that cold water pipe as the main grounding electrode for our powering system, or for our system that powers our home. Now, to better get a better idea of kind of what's going on here, we kind of have to consider that the fact that the main electrical panel that you have in your house, there's really only 3 wires that are coming into it, into the top of it, as you can see here. And I've got it kind of labeled as L1, L2, and a neutral conductor. And that L1 and L2, those are considered the live conductors. And what's happening is those come into the main service breaker into the top of your electrical panel. And one line kind of feeds one side of the panel and the other line kind of feeds the second side. So there's kind of 2 sides here where there's you can see a whole series of breakers here. And those breakers are really are responsible for kind of distributing the electricity through your home. And if you look to the right of that, you can also see that there's a service neutral connector, a neutral conductor here. And that neutral conductor is really responsible for more returning the electric current back to its source. I mean, this is kind of the idea here. And in AC power here, which is really what we're dealing with in our home, this is something that's called alternating current. And I kind of showed this in my electric field kind of video series. I kind of gave a little demonstration of that, is that it's really the electric current that's kind of, flipping directions back and forth here. It's kind of sourcing itself from its power source and it's kind of returning itself to its power source. So there's this constant bidirectional activity that's happening here. And really what it's kind of truly doing here, we kind of represent this as more of a sine wave on how this motion kind of works, which is, in my view, it's a little bit deceiving to kind of look at it that way, because really I think all we're kind of doing here is just artificially kind of flipping the direction here of the electric current. And it's not a true kind of sinusoidal circular type of motion that we're dealing with. And this is something I'm going to be covering here in future videos, but it's important to kind of to see that at least, because when we're dealing with this neutral conductor here that's supposed to be responsible for returning the current to its source, it's also a little deceiving to call this a neutral conductor, because in my view it's really anything but neutral at all. And we also have to realize that this neutral conductor is always made, there's always a connection directly to the earth. And that is for a level of safety. Again, like we just kind of talked about, is our power distribution system, some point of it has to be kind of referenced to the earth so that it's got that lower resistance path to kind of discharge some of that electricity out of the system instead of kind of, passing through you. This is kind of a, basic idea of what's going on here. But you can see at the top, those are the only three conductors that we're dealing with. Now, if you look at the bottom here, there's another connection there that's actually what's called the grounding electrode. So that neutral has to be grounded per code. The same thing with this electrical box that all these breakers are in. This thing's made of metal. And anything that's made of metal has the potential to, shock you if you touch it. So as per the electrical code, this has to be grounded too. So you can see what we're doing here is that we've got a connection here with kind of a bare wire that's going back down to our main cold water pipe. Because our cold water pipe is made of copper, and this is going directly out into the earth. So what we're doing in some cases is we're using that cold water pipe as that grounding electrode. And that's very common on how we do this within the home. Now, there are other possibilities here too, where your main cold water line may not be copper. Back in the 1980s, 1990s or so, we used to use kind of a more plastic material, something that's called polybutylene. We're not using that so much anymore, but in a condition like that, where you have an insulating type of material, you can't ground that. And more common today, we actually use more of a high density kind of polyethylene material, which is kind of short form HDPE. This is another material that might be coming into your house. And again, this is something that we can't ground. We cannot use this type of system as a grounding electrode. So in some cases, what we have to do is we actually have to use a ground rod. We've got to drive a ground rod right into the earth. And coming up here shortly, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about so you can kind of see how we're doing this. So you can kind of see how your electrical system that comes into your home, how it's truly electrically grounded, and how we're using this cold water pipe in all these situations here. And we'll get a better idea on how we can actually see some of this dirty electricity that's being kind of contaminated onto these cold water pipes, and really truly where it's coming from. Now, under normal electrical operating conditions, this grounding electrode that I'm talking about, whether it's the cold water pipe or whether it's a ground rod that you have driven in the earth, it's not intended to carry a continuous conduction current. That's not its intended purpose. It's only there for specific conditions. And one condition I talked about earlier is to kind of provide a level of safety for you. And in a case where maybe a live conductor touches a grounded surface of some sort, and you make contact with that surface, instead of that electricity flowing through you, it's got a lower resistance path to kind of go through the ground. So that's kind of one condition here where we would see that grounding electrode becoming more live with electricity. Now, another reason why is because, we could have what are called power surges on our power system that comes into our home. Now, this power system that comes into our home, for the most part, it's stable. It's pretty stable to kind of keep everything kind of running in a normal kind of condition here. But under some circumstances, there could be really a spike. And really this power surge that comes into your home, it has the potential to really become destructive to all of the equipment that you have plugged into your wall. And if you really have any sensitive, more expensive equipment, And we've kind of seen this before, maybe during the night there could have been something happen on the power system, and then you wake up the next morning and maybe your entertainment system doesn't work or your TV doesn't work. Something of this nature, because there's been a huge power surge that's come through and it's kind of damaged the equipment. And in a lot of cases, I know I have one of these on my panel, we have what are called surge suppressors. And in a condition like that, where we have a spike of, a power spike of electricity, we have this surge suppressor to essentially grab that and discharge it into the earth, so that the earth will carry that discharge of electricity instead of going through and damaging some of your components or your electrical equipment that you have in your home. So that's another reason why we could see that grounded electrode becoming more alive with electricity. And the same thing if we actually get lightning. If we get a lightning strike, this can be catastrophic for our electrical components that we have plugged in. And it's kind of the same situation here, is we want that grounded electrode is going to help us here, where a lot of that lightning energy can be just safely discharged down into the earth. And in the industrial automation sector where I came from, we used to use, what are called lightning arresters. We used to put these on sensitive machines that will protect you from that. If lightning does hit the building and there's that potential there that you can damage your equipment, but that lightning arrestor will just discharge a lot of that electricity directly down through the grounding electrode into the earth. So again, we have another scenario where we have that grounded electrode kind of conducting electric current. But you can see here that these are not continuous things that happen, right? They may be just specific times that they happen, and that's great. That's kind of what the grounding circuit is for. So, but what I'm seeing and what others are seeing with this cold water pipe here, it's continuously live with electricity. And we really have to remember that this cold water pipe that's coming into our home, it's always connected to that neutral conductor on our power system. And again, in some circumstances, electricity will try and find the least resistive path to kind of get back to its source. And that neutral conductor is a means of that electricity trying to return to its source. So under some certain circumstances, we've seen this before too, where kind of the ground path here will be kind of providing that return pathway for that electricity to get back to its source, as opposed to that neutral conductor. So there are some conditions where that could be possible. And that's something that we need to consider, and that's something that can be really very, very challenging to try and diagnose, especially when you look at all the possibilities on what could set up that kind of condition to happen. And I've been really kind of looking at that, and it's really a delicate system that we're dealing with here, and it's so challenging to kind of diagnose some of this stuff. So that's another condition that we have to realize, that grounded electrode and the ground path, it's always connected to that neutral return line for the electricity. So it's almost like we've got a kind of a parallel type of connection going on here. And in some cases, it could be used. And you could see electricity coming up through your cold water pipe, coming into your electrical panel, and then kind of returning back to its source that way. But really the main focus of this video is something that I see here, which can really cause this electric or this grounding electrode to be kind of more conductive with electricity, is by something that's actually called ground loops. And with ground loops, this is something that I had to deal with in my 15-year career out in the electrical engineering world. I used to be involved in designing and building robotic machinery, robotic welding machinery. And this was a very common problem that we had to deal with, especially within the robotic system, where we have a lot of delicate communication happening between different, parts of the machine. If there were any ground loops that were present on the system, this was really something that was almost catastrophic as far as disturbing the information system within the machine, at least the communication between the source and the destination. It could really be a chronic disturbance to that. And this was something that we were constantly fighting with in the engineering world on how to deal with this, because we'd always get the machine to start behaving in a way that was not desired, and it really had to do with a lot. It had a lot to do with the nature of the ground loops that was causing a disruption in the communication between, the source and the destination. So ground loops are a really serious problem in the industrial kind of automation sector. And I've kind of applied that method of thinking to really what could be going on here inside our homes. Because I see something very similar with what we're doing in our own home compared to what we were doing in the industry where I came from. And it had a lot to do with how we were grounding our systems. And really a ground loop, what it is, it's a current that flows within the grounding system. Kind of like what we're seeing here. We got an indication of it on our cold water pipes, which are buried out into the earth. So it's kind of showing that there's a lot of electric current activity happening within the earth. So there's something very similar happening here. And in the industrial automation industry where I came from, it was very, very big that we had to, there were a lot of common grounding practices that we had to follow. And a big one was that we all had to make sure that there was kind of one central point to where all the ground wires were connected to, or where they were terminated to, is probably a better way to say. So it's something that we actually call a star grounding connection. And if there are any electrical engineering people watching this, you'll know exactly what I mean by that. And it was imperative that we had to maintain that. And if we decided to not do that, instead of going to one central place to ground all of our wires, and we started to do it at different positions within the system, if we started grounding at different positions within the system, what happens is that that change in position here, where we're actually terminating the grounds, there very well could be a potential difference between those 2 points, because it's not exactly the same point where we're making that ground connection to. And if there's a potential difference between those 2 ground points, now we have a potential here. There's a voltage. And we also know that ground path that we're using, it's not truly zero in its resistance. There's always some little resistance present. So when we have voltage and we have resistance, with kind of basic electrical engineering knowledge, kind of with Ohm's law, this gives the potential for current to flow. So this is something that we had, this was a no-no in the world that I came from, because you'd pay for it. And it would be very, very hard to try and diagnose and fix. We'd spend hours, even days on it sometimes, trying to fix it. Why? There was a level of communication going on within the machine, and there was message from the source was not getting to its destination. There was a corruption that was happening along the way. And it had to do with this grounding concept that I'm talking about. And to remedy the problem was always trying to fix the grounding system at some level. And we wasted hours, days trying to fix this sometimes. So it's really catastrophic. The ground loops that we see within the system can really destroy the information system within the robotic machine. Now, I thought that was very interesting to kind of think of it that way, because I'm seeing something very similar with what's going on here within the home, but in a little different way, because I'm seeing the ground loops are there, and when we combine these electric current ground loops that we're finding in the earth, when we combine them with something that's called geopathic stress. What geopathic stress is really a disturbance within the Earth that kind of disrupts really the natural magnetic field of the Earth, which is really what I'm defining as the information system here that we're all a part of. We're all connected to the Earth's magnetic field. We may not know how, but we are. And when you combine those two variables together with the dirty electric current, with the geopathic stress, and the electric field component that I'm seeing that's radiating off these wires in our own home, which is radiating at about 60 hertz, and all the harmonics of the 60 hertz. When you combine those three variables together, what I'm seeing is really the potential, I'm using my words very clearly because what I'm trying to do is kind of propose a new idea, a new theory to think about here. Because if what I'm saying has any truth, this is something that could be, this is big. When we combine these three variables together here, the dirty electric current, geopathic stress, and the electric field from the wires, this could be something that could really disturb the information system within the human body. And in my theory, that information system within the human body, it's all happening within water. So that's the connection that I'm trying to make here. This video is just an introduction to this, to kind of give you guys kind of something to think about here as these videos go along. I want to present some of these ideas that I'm beginning to see here, because this is something that could be really paralyzing, really the metabolic activity that's happening within us, especially with what's happening with our immune system. And it may be something that could be there that could be really causing a lot of chronic distress here for people that are really sick and for those that just can't get well. Now, I truly believe that all the water that's inside of our bodies and all the water that's inside, anything that's alive, that water is permanently connected to the Earth's magnetic field. And I don't think we truly understand how that connection works yet, because what I see here is water behaves just like an induction motor. And it's really what's providing all of the motive power to do all the work that needs to be done inside of our body, which includes, our mobility and the way that we can move our arms and get up and walk around. Water is really fundamental in all of that. And with what I'm seeing here, with what I'm talking about here, with a lot of this dirty electricity that's in the Earth, our house is sitting on top of the Earth. We have the geopathic stress points, because the only way to truly understand geopathic stress is we have to consider that there is a crystal-like grid in the backdrop of space that we all exist in. There is something there, and I'm not the first one to kind of propose that. I think going back 100 years ago, this was kind of really foundational in a lot of Nikola Tesla's work at the time. But the physicists at the time, they wanted no part of that, and it was completely dismissed. And now we have relativistic space-time as the background of our reality here. And we really have to consider that there is a crystal-like grid behind us, because there is, if that is true, there are specific points to where those, this is all geometry here, and where certain crossings kind of happen within the space. And if our bodies are in that field here where those crossings could be happening, and we have all of this 50, 60 hertz electric field activity buzzing all around us, kind of permeating and interacting with our body, what I'm seeing that could be possible with all this is that really the regular water that's inside of our bodies, there's a disturbance or a change that could occur here. And that change that I'm talking about is when we actually take regular water and turn it into something that's called heavy water, or deuterium water is another name for it. And Jesse and I did a video about this a few years ago to kind of talk about the nature of deuterium. I think you guys should really go watch that video because this substance can be really catastrophic for really human health and really how the body functions. Especially if this is something we're bringing in and introducing into our body on a regular basis. And this is something that we need to think about because I've got some scientific data that kind of puts a lot of this together with kind of the model that I'm kind of beginning to present to you guys. That kind of really works on a principle of resonance. That's really how this kind of works. And again, when we look at water, it's made of hydrogen and oxygen. And what's fundamental in this substance here is really the nature of the proton. And if we go over to this electric field series that I'm doing, you're going to see I talk a lot about this proton and how really the true nature of electric current is inside that proton. And it goes into a dimension of space that's not physical. And this is something that's really truly universal in my model. And that proton really acts as the information source here. It's like a grounding source for the information that's kind of shaping and kind of building this physical world here. So this is, I don't think we have an accurate understanding of the magnetic field at all. I mean, we don't know how the Earth generates its magnetic field. Truly, we don't at the fundamental level. So I just wanted to kind of present this to you guys here because this is kind of why I'm doing this video, because this is what I'm seeing. And I'm just trying to find different ways to kind of, present this information to you guys so you can kind of take a look at it for yourselves. Because I'm doing a lot of work in the field with this and looking at the nature of that dirty electric plumbing current and checking for geopathic stress and definitely checking for all the electric field activity that's coming off these wires. And I'm finding something there's a common theme here that I'm seeing with all of these things is a lot of my clients that I'm seeing, they're very sick. So again, I'm gonna kind of leave it at that for now. And what I'm gonna do now is I kind of want to end off this portion of the video here to kind of I'm just gonna put some slides up now so you can kind of see this grounding system that I'm talking about. So you can get a better idea of what's going on within our home and actually how we ground our home. And you might be able to begin to see how some of these ground loops can just naturally, they're just naturally there because of some of these practices that we're doing. And I'm going to be basing this off of really the electrical code. I'm going to be going by the National Electrical Code on what their requirements are for this stuff. Because this is, in the electrical engineering world, this is what we follow. We have to follow the electrical code, whatever country you live in. This is very fundamental here. So I'm going to present this to you guys so you guys get a better idea. I just want you to kind of see this, and then to end off this video, I'm just going to show you some demonstrations here about what some of the measurements that I've found in my own home and some of the measurements that I'm finding in my clients' homes. So you can see how intense and how high some of these dirty electric currents are on the copper plumbing. Now this first image that I've got up here, guys, is kind of just showing you more of a typical electrical grounding system for your home, especially when you have the cold water pipe involved. And I'm kind of really basing this upon really the National Electrical Code. This is kind of what's defining the requirements here as far as how we need to make these connections. And what's really important to kind of state here first is that really the National Electrical Code, it allows you to use your cold water pipe as the main grounding electrode for your system. And this is the part of the code that deals with that is actually 250.52. And it actually states if your cold water pipe goes down into the earth and goes through the earth for at least a continuous run of at least 10 feet, it is okay to use your grounding, your cold water pipe as a grounding electrode. And that's kind of important to kind of mention here, because if that is not maintained and that cold water pipe does not go through the earth a minimum of 10 feet, there has to be a supplement connection being made here. And that's usually made with a ground rod. And this image here is kind of depicting that. And as you can see here, I kind of have it circled here in red. This is your main cold water pipe that comes into your home. And if you look at the number 1 symbol, it's kind of pointing to a box here. This is actually showing your main service disconnect. Now this might be your main service breaker inside your main electrical panel in your home. And coming out the bottom of that, you can see it's actually going to a ground symbol at the bottom. And that ground symbol it's really depicting that is actually making a connection to a ground rod. So in this image, we kind of have both. We kind of have the cold water pipe that's going out into the earth. And in this case, it may not be going through the earth for up to 10 feet. So we have to have that ground rod present. So this is kind of depicting all of it here in this kind of image. But if you notice the cold water pipe here, at the bottom of it, you can see there's a green wire. And that's really your bonding jumper there's a connection that needs to be made from your cold water pipe to your electrical system. And this is really depicting kind of that connection can be made in 4 different places. And you can see with option number 1, you can make that connection right into the service disconnect or right into your main electrical panel. And that's the condition that I have in my home. My cold water pipe, there's a wire that's going directly into my main electrical panel, and it's going right to that grounding lug inside that. So that's kind of what it's depicting here too. And you can also see that actually could be made at section number, or item number 4 here. It's actually showing you that's actually where the ground rod is. So you could actually make that connection from your cold water pipe directly to your ground rod if you wanted to. Or it could even be made somewhere along the wire that goes from your ground rod up to your main electrical panel. That's kind of depicted as number 3. So it's kind of showing you there's just a few different options here. And what one we choose, and that's not really important here. That's not really the scope of this video, but I just wanted to kind of show you kind of how this works here and kind of, more of a typical connection for the grounding electrode for your home. Now this next image here is kind of showing you that if you do have a ground rod connection, like say for example your cold water pipe, again it's buried into the earth and it's not running through the earth up to 10 feet, or maybe it's made of plastic, like I talked about before. You can't ground a plastic water pipe. So you wouldn't be able to use your cold water pipe directly as that grounding electrode. You need a supplement connection here, like a ground rod, for example. So that's another means of doing this. And this image is kind of showing you how that is kind of typically done. And if you look at the image on the left here, you can see there's a few things going on. On the right-hand side, you can see there's your main electrical panel. That would be, what's down in your basement, for example, if you live in a home. And coming out the top of it, you can see there's a conduit, and it's going over to the main service breaker. And that's really your service disconnect here. And in most cases, that main breaker will be installed into your main electrical panel at the top. But in this case, it's kind of showing it as separate. But you can kind of ignore that for this portion of the video here. But to the left of that service disconnect, you can see that's actually where your smart meter is. And that's usually kind of bolted on the side of your house. And then out of the top of the smart meter, that's actually going up, and that's actually what's going directly out to the utility or your power service, wherever that's coming from. And in most cases, that's more than likely coming from some type of distribution transformer. There could be a distribution transformer on the ground, and we've seen these in our cities, or there could be distribution transformers up on the poles, and sometimes they got like 3 of them kind of around each other. And that's the transformer that's kind of stepping down the really high voltage that's kind of being transmitted and distributed throughout the city. It's kind of stepping it down to this safe level here where we've got those 3 wires that I talked about earlier that come into your home. And they kind of give us our 208 volts and our 120 volts here. Kind of gives us all the power that we need. And it comes directly into your smart meter. That's kind of where the wiring comes first. And when we're putting a ground rod in, you can see it's actually, this case, it's actually giving you 3 different options on actually how we can wire that ground rod into your home's power system. And you can see up at the top there, that's item number 1. You can actually make that ground rod connection directly to the service feeder, the feeder service that's coming into your house somewhere out there. That is, you are allowed to do that. Or the second option would be you can actually go right into the smart meter. And this is very common actually, where we actually make that ground rod connection into your smart meter. Or number 3, it could be going right directly into your main electrical panel, where your main service breaker is. And these are kind of just 3 typical ways of doing that. But what's really important here too, as you can see in all these 3 conditions, is that that ground rod connection, you can see it's actually making a connection in to that neutral conductor again. We talked about this before on how anytime we talk about this neutral conductor here in the electrical engineering world, we have to think that this thing is always grounded somewhere. And in most cases, it's done in multiple places. So this is kind of depicting that. And it's very important to see that, because this is going to tie into kind of where I'm kind of leave off on this video here, with really getting into the nature of ground loops and what we could be doing here. Now with the image on the right, it's actually showing you more kind of a practical diagram here that shows actually the ground rod right into the earth. So you can see on the left, you've got the smart meter, you've got a wire coming out the bottom of the smart meter, going directly into the earth. You can see there's a white kind of line there going vertical. That is your ground rod in this case. And you can see I got a kind of red circle here that's kind of showing you some clamps. And those clamps go around the copper ground rod, so you can actually make a wire connection that goes up to your smart meter. So that's kind of how your wiring from the smart meter goes down into the ground rod. So it's kind of showing you this here. But what's important here, I kind of wanted to show you guys, is this is actually very important, is that as per the National Electrical Code, when we have a ground rod like this in place that we're using for our main grounding electrode, in this case maybe our cold water pipe doesn't meet the criteria, the resistance of that ground rod has to be 25 ohms or less. And if the resistance is higher than 25 ohms, what this code is also telling you to do is that you actually have to supplement in a second ground rod. And you can kind of see that depicted here. There's kind of a wire or a 6-gauge bonding jumper going from the first grounding rod over to the second one. And it needs to be, it's also showing you that it needs to be about 6 feet apart, minimum. And this will hopefully get you to below that 25 ohm range, which is what is needed here in order to make a good quality kind of grounding connection. With this last slide here I wanted to show you, just kind of summarizes all of this now and kind of leaves us kind of going to the place that I want to go with this, is that if you look at the image on the left, you can see that's a typical grounding system that's using a ground rod. It's coming right out the bottom of your smart meter and going into a ground rod into the earth. And that grounds your whole home, essentially. And if you look at the image on the right, I put house number 2. So I'm kind of showing you 2 different houses here. Now, house number 1, for example, let's say this could be your house, or it could be my house. And then house number 2, this could be my neighbor. Or even better yet, house number 2 could be someone that lives across the city, for example, that has a very similar situation. They have a power system that's powering up their home. It needs to be grounded, just like mine does. And they're using a ground rod, just like I am. So this is kind of showing you that. Now, what's important to kind of see here is that, again, we kind of have to meet this criteria of the ground rod has to be 25 ohms or less. So I just put a couple of values in here just to kind of give you guys a kind of way to think about this here, is that in house number 1, let's say this is my house and my ground rod, I actually achieved 20 ohms. Now if we go over to the house across the street, they have a ground rod that's driven into the earth, and say they got a little bit better than me, they got 14 ohms. What's really important that I'm seeing with this is that I hope this is completely obvious to you guys here, is that this grounding connection that I'm making in my home and my neighbor is making in his home down the street, this is not a unified ground connection. This is not. And I'm hoping this is obvious to you, because this sets up the foundation for all of my work going forward, which is the very fact that the electrical ground is true unity. And I really think we've completely missed this in all of science. Now, I seem to think that our science is kind of going towards something of a unity in nature with science. We're trying to unify science, and how we're going to do that that's a number of other videos that I want to do on that topic, because there is something unified here, like I talked about before, the true nature of electric current, which is not a conduction current. I think the nature of conductance and resistance is really illusory in nature. And I think this is something that only exists within our 5 sense perceptive world, that experience that we're having here, which I don't think is truly the fundamental nature of what's going on here. And I know we're kind of going into some deeper territories here, but it's important to be open-minded to this. And this electrical grounding circuit, it really doesn't make a true connection here in this physical world. This is pretty much where all my work is kind of leading to here. And I think the right way to kind of think about this is to consider that really this entire world experience here is really just kind of a play of 5 different states of matter. And really this is kind of the most basic kind of description, scientific description that we can really come up with here. But in my view, the first 3 states of matter here, which is really the gas, the liquid, and the solid phases, these 3 phases really become truly fundamental here in this physical world experience that we're experiencing through the 5 senses, where everything within these 3 states of matter, they almost appear like they're relative to us. That us being wherever that dimension of human perception is within us that allows us to perceive this physical world, like through our eyes and through our skin, and these 5 senses that we have here. These 3 states of matter become really truly fundamental. And these 3 states of matter are primarily, the primary ingredient within all 3 of these phases is hydrogen, this very first element on the periodic table. This is really the kind of the foundation for all these 3 states of matter, on how they kind of interplay with each other here and how they change states. And with all my work here, with what I'm doing on this electric field series, you can see that I'm going inside that hydrogen element, which is just a proton, where it takes us into a new, much more subtle dimension of space, where we now have to kind of get into this 4th phase of matter, which is a plasma. And if you look at what we know in science today about a plasma, it's really associated with really heat energy. It's kind of a hot plasma type of gas that we've been kind of experimenting with in science today. And really anything that's associated with heat like that, we have to associate a level of chaos. So this ionic type of plasma gas that we've been dealing with is very chaotic in nature. So there's really a lack of kind of organized content within it, that at least that we haven't been able to find yet. But this plasma type of gas in my model, it's kind of inverted from that, where it becomes like a cold plasma type of gas that just sits right in this universal dimension of space that I've been kind of proposing here. And it really becomes a very incredible, delicate type of gas that's associated with our mind, with this very dimension of human perception. And this cold plasma type of gas that I'm talking about here really also becomes the true nature of electric current in my model, which is kind of going a little bit deeper than really the nature of the displacement current in electrical engineering that goes on within the dielectric of a capacitor. There's something even much more subtle that I see going on here. And the idea of a conduction current here is something that I think is truly illusory in nature. And if we look at this fifth phase of matter, that Bose-Einstein condensate here that we've got, in my view, from the work that I've done, I think this is kind of our best attempt to try and describe this delicate plasma type of dielectric current here. And really the true fifth phase in my work is something that's, completely beyond. It's beyond anything that we could ever conceptualize within our human mind. So in my view, we're nowhere even close to the true fifth element in science. So this changes things significantly here by looking at it from this perspective. And this grounding circuit that I see this is what we're grounding into. But we can't quite see that yet. When these ground rods, when we're driving them into the earth, we're driving a copper solid type of state of matter into a more solid type of state of matter, which is the earth. And we're making a connection that way. But that connection, I think we have to go, it doesn't make a connection in this physical world. There's something much deeper here. And that connection doesn't work by means of a normal electrical connection that we would make by means of a conductor, by means of continuity is probably the right word to use here. This electrical grounding circuit that I'm talking about, it works on a completely different principle, really under the principle of resonance and electromagnetic induction, which is a subject that I don't think we truly understand its roots either. And these two are fundamental here. So this grounding circuit that I'm talking about, it becomes like a tuning circuit. This is kind of the method that we need to look at if we want to truly make a unified ground connection here and kind of eliminate some of these ground loop noise issues that we're creating deep in the earth that I don't even think we can really truly see yet. That's causing all this chaos within Mother Nature and how its fundamental information system within that universal electric field circuit, or the rotating magnetic field, if we want to look at it from that perspective. And we all live within that rotating magnetic field. So I think it's very important to consider this and what I'm saying here. What we seem to be doing here in this entire electrical engineering world, especially with the concept of grounding, we're just driving ground rods into the earth and thinking that as long as we just get it into the earth, we're making a ground connection. But notice that we're always going to have difference of resistance. So there's an impedance here involved. There's something impeding the current flow. And with something that I'm suggesting with grounding being true unity, like this impedance is like this has to disappear. It has to disappear somewhere. With what is going on here, if my house, for example, is 20 ohms, my neighbor is 14 ohms, you can see we have a difference of resistance. And this grounding system is connected into the neutral line, which is not anything that's truly neutral by any means. So there's always going to be some level of potential here too involved in this with the difference of resistance. And when you have voltage and resistance, that's all you need to kind of generate a current, which is how a lot of these ground loops might be forming. But they might be forming in a space that's not physical, because that's where the true nature of electric current is. And it could be causing a lot of disturbances in that dimension of space that I'm talking about here that's really causing a lot of chaos here in the physical. And I know that may not be so obvious to see because we didn't learn any of this stuff in electrical engineering. Especially I didn't. I know that for a fact. But I've been looking into things a little bit differently as of the last few years. And I'm beginning to see things a lot differently. And there's something to what I'm saying here. And I just wanted to kind of show you some of these slides here so you can kind of see it now and get an idea that these grounding electrodes that we're driving into the earth, they're connected to the three-phase power distribution, neutral termination point, which is anything really but neutral. Not by my definition of neutral. It's a very deceptive word to use there. And our idea of three-phase power, that's a whole different video that I'd love to do to kind of, that maybe what I'm going to do next is to kind of get into a video that kind of shows a little bit about what's going on with this neutral, what it means, how it works, and how it works with how it's bringing the power into our home. I'm definitely going to do some videos on that to kind of put some perspective in, at least from the way I'm seeing it. But I'll leave this video off at that because I just wanted to kind of show you guys that this grounding connection that we're doing all over the earth, we're doing it everywhere on the earth. And it's not a unified connection. It's anything but. And this could be really disturbing Mother Nature, Mother Earth. We're disturbing Mother Earth here. And that disturbance that I'm talking about, I think it presents itself in the Earth's magnetic field. That disturbance that I'm suggesting here is kind of distorting the Earth's magnetic field. And we're all connected to that. Everything that's alive is connected to that on this planet. I mean, we're growing our food into the earth, and a lot of this dirty electricity flowing through the earth. We have to consider that. So anyway, I'm going to stop at that. We're going to kind of end this portion of the video off, and then next I'm just going to kind of end off this video showing you some more live demonstrations of kind of what I'm finding in my home and some other clients, so you can kind of see this kind of firsthand. Okay, so I'm just down in my basement here. I just wanted to kind of show you guys kind of how some of this stuff works and kind of what I'm measuring in my own home, because like I said earlier, I kind of came across this subject many years ago when I was first dealing with Lyme and getting into this EMF world because I knew it was a problem. And I started taking some measurements in my own home, and it wasn't anything significant here that I was measuring, so I kind of just left it aside for the time being, and I'm going to show you guys kind of what I mean by that. But it's a subject that's been kind of growing on me very more recently here, that I'm going into more clients' homes, and I am looking at this, and I'm seeing some significant changes between some of the homes. Some homes are extremely high, some not so much, and it's kind of my mission to really get to the bottom of this, to kind of see what is really going on here, and how can we come together as a group to kind of fix some of this stuff. But you can see down at the bottom here, this is where my cold water comes out of the ground, comes out of the floor here. And I'm taking my measurements. You can see I got 2 clamp meters here, and I'm measuring maybe about 6-8 inches from the floor. And right above those 2 clamps here, you can see this is the clamp that goes to the cold water pipe. Here's my bonding wire right here that goes directly to the electrical panel. You can see that there's a screw connection here that's making that ground wire connection. And above it we got the main shutoff valve, and then over here you can see we got the water meter, and then this copper pipe just goes in and feeds my hot water tank and pretty much the rest of my home. So it's a pretty basic kind of system that we've got here. And yeah, I'm just gonna zoom into some of my meters here. I'm just gonna show you what I'm measuring here. So I got, the first meter I got here is it's my scope meter. I got a couple fluke meters that I'm using here. They're great meters for stuff like this. And you can see at the top right corner there, I'm about 0.12 amps. So that's about 120 milliamps here. And if you look at the nature of the signal that we're dealing with here, it's more of a sinusoidal type of signal that is very contaminated with. You can see there's a lot of harmonics on this signal here. It's a very dirty type of signal. And if I go over here to my other meter here, I've got actually it's a Fluke 1630 earth ground clamp. It's a pretty nice meter for stuff like this, and you can see what I'm measuring here is about 130. That's in milliamps. I got the milliamp setting on there. So yeah, this meter is really great for stuff like this, and it's also good for measuring resistances of ground rods and stuff like that too. So I can do all kinds of stuff with this meter. But you can see this one's about 120 milliamps. This one's about 130. Very close. And that level of current flow on the copper water pipe, 6-8 inches from the ground is not, it's significantly low considering some of the other homes that I've kind of visited. And one other thing that I will do here too, I'm just going to take this ground clamp here and I'm going to just put it around the main bonding wire here. Now this is the bonding wire that goes from my cold water pipe up to the electrical panel. And you can see I got about 90 milliamps. So this grounding wire is carrying a continuous current here. And if you remember from the previous section of this video, we kind of looked at, why would a ground wire like this start carrying a continuous current? Jesse and I just kind of renovated our basement just recently, and we actually used a special type of wire down here. I'm just going to go up here. I'm just going to kind of zoom in and show you guys. This is the type of wire that we used in our basement. It's actually what's called BX cable. It's got an armored conductive jacket around it, as you can see. And this wiring here, we're using it for our pot lights, receptacles, switches. It's everything in their basement is we're using this cable everywhere. But when this cable goes into one of the electrical boxes, whether it's for your pot light, whether it's for your switch or receptacle, doesn't matter, this cable will actually be clamped. It'll be clamped to that electrical box. And that electrical box is always grounded. By code, we have to. So what's happening here is that actually this cable here with that conductive jacket, it's always maintaining that ground connection. And this works beautifully for trying to mitigate the electric field radiative component from the wiring. And I'm going to be doing videos to kind of show you what that looks like and how destructive that can be. But this wiring pretty much 100% eliminates that. So that electric field radiation component is pretty much non-existent in my basement. But it does come at a cost, because this particular type of wire, when we look at how we're connecting it into our electrical boxes and how we're grounding it, if we come down here to the bottom again, you can see that anytime we make a connection like this with a wire or with the conductive jacket of that BX cable, we make a connection like this using a screw terminal. And anytime we use a screw terminal type of connection like this, we're always adding some type of, resistive quality into the conductive path. And that's just the nature of using a terminal like this. They never ever give you a perfect zero type of resistance connection. It's just not possible. And in the world that I come from, the electrical engineering world, that's why we always used to say that the least amount of connections in a system, the better. And this is a perfect example of that. Because anytime we make a connection like this, especially at different positions, even though it's the same potential, theoretically, we do this at different positions, we're always adding a little bit of, these resistive type of qualities into your connections. And especially when we're doing this on the ground path, this is where we start to create ground loops. And this is a chronic condition that is very destructive in its nature. And if you guys are following along with this video here, you can see that we are doing this everywhere. we are causing this type of problem to manifest everywhere. Anytime we make this connection into the ground and it's never at the same, the resistance is never the same, and we don't really even know what we're grounding into. We're just driving it into the earth thinking that, you know, it's going into the earth, that's fine, it's a good connection, but we have to do better than that, guys. We're really making a mess with what we're doing here on this planet with our electrical system. And it's our lack of understanding of this electrical ground on where it actually truly terminates to within space. And it's the most poorly understood subject in all of science, in my view, is this electrical ground. It's the most poorly understood, and we have really ignored it for, you know, the last many decades here, and we really need to explore this and re-examine it again. And I don't think we're ever going to get to a true accurate understanding with the science that we have, with kind of the Einsteinian view of space and time. We're not going to get there, guys. I think we have to be open-minded to a new model, and that's kind of what I'm trying to propose to you, because this electrical grounding connection is true unity. And if we could explore that and experiment with that, this could be, the possibilities are absolutely incredible with what we could do with this. And not only can we just clean up some of the stuff that we're doing here, there's so many other possibilities opening up with this, because that true unity connection, I've described it earlier, that fourth phase, it's an infinite mind-space type of substance where the source of human perception is within the human mind. This is a game changer if I'm accurate on this. And it changes everything. It even would change everything, the way that you even look at yourself, on who you are and how you even experience and perceive the physical world. It's a game changer. The possibilities are endless here, and it's worth exploring. And how I've kind of come to explore this myself is, well, you're looking at it. Just by looking at, you know, what we're doing with the earth ground and trying to figure out kind of how this stuff works. And, you know, one thing has led to the other, and you look back in history at some of the stuff that we've ignored, and here we are. And I have some ideas to propose on what might be going on here, guys, to help really remedy some of this stuff. We could really make these homes safe for people to live. Because what I think we're doing here is really contributing to just more suffering as far as chronic health is concerned. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of show you guys what's going on in my own home here. As you can see, it's not a huge problem here, but in the next section here, I'm going to show you a client that I was just recently at. I'm going to show you some of the measurements I was getting there. They are absolutely way beyond anything that you're seeing here. And it's kind of my mission to kind of shed some light on some of this stuff and get an idea of, get a better understanding of what's going on here and what we could do to possibly remedy some of this stuff. And I want to show you what I'm doing with some of my clients on what I'm doing to make sure that they are not experiencing this type of stuff, along with the electric field radiation that we're getting from the wires. So there's some things that we can do. There's some things that I'm doing, and I'd kind of like to share some of that with you. So we'll leave it at that for now, and we're going to go and take a look and see what I'm finding at some of the other clients' house here now. Okay guys, just before I'm heading upstairs, I just turned the power back on again. And you can see by doing that, it jumped up to about 3.4 amps. This is the highest reading I've actually measured here at this home. And this is right at, you can see where the ground connection is. I'm going to go up the copper pipe here into this area. You can see that it's still at about 3.4 amps. And I can measure this all the way up. You can see this cold water pipe goes all the way up and actually feeds into this hot water tank. So the whole copper, the cold water line, all of it is live, every part of it. And the fact that we're actually taking this this jumper here, so I know you can't really see very well because it's kind of dark down here. I'll try and, you can see here's the main cold water pipe that comes into the hot water tank. You can see we actually have a bonding connection here with this copper wire going over to this side over here, and this is actually the natural gas that feeds into this hot water tank. So now what we've done is actually we've made this whole cold water, dirty electricity that we're finding on this cold water line. We're actually bonding that over to the natural gas line, and we're actually contaminating this now too.